I have told this story 100 times, and each time my hands still tremble a little at the memory. Not because it makes me weak, far from it, but because when I close my eyes, I can still feel the cool stone under the mansion's gate, the hush of rooms that smelled of orange polish and linen starch, and the way a thin young girl learns the difference between a house and a prison. They sent me away because there was no other way. My mother said the wealthy family would give me a roof, a job, a chance to learn something useful to earn my keep while my brothers could study. She wrapped a faded scarf around my shoulders, pressed a small, crooked locket into my palm, and kissed me on the forehead as if she were tucking me into a place of safety. I remember the way her fingers lingered on my cheek, like she was anchoring me to the only reason I could go, to help them, to survive. The truth was sharper. We had more mouths than money, and the offer sounded like relief. I was 13. I had a sliver of a schoolbook stashed under my mattress and big, clumsy dreams that taught me how to read a whole chapter at midnight by the cold light of a kerosene lamp. When the day came, I walked away with a small bundle of clothes, my notebook, my mother's scarf, and a hollow feeling in my chest that I called courage. By the time I reached the mansion, the sun was low, and the shadows had already started to warm the marble. The gate was taller than any wall I'd known. A gardener in a spotless jacket bowed as I passed, as if he knew I had no right to be there, and yet was allowed in, by the whim of those who could give and take life with the same hand. The lady of the house, my employer, met me at the door. She wore calm like a uniform. Her smile was practiced and polite. Her eyes measured me like a tailor fitting cloth. She spoke kindly enough as she explained the hours, the rules, the smallness of the room I would sleep in. It was all said with soft sentences that landed heavy on my shoulders. But the younger brother watched from the background. He leaned against a pillar, arms folded, lips thin with amusement. There are some looks that arrive in a person's face like winter, quick, silver, and cold. His was one of those looks. It was nothing I could change. It was nothing I deserved. I did not know then that houses have hierarchies like ladders, and each rung holds a different kind of worth. I only knew chores. I rose before dawn, performed the small rituals that meant service, sweep the veranda until the dust felt like powder under my feet, empty the troughs, polish the shoes until they shone like coins. I carried linen and soap and heavy buckets of water. The muscles in my arms grew hard in ways schoolwork never could. Breakfast for them was a ceremony. For me it was in the kitchen with the staff, a tin plate and bread warmed on coals. I ate quickly, my fingers stained with lime from scrubbing the bowls. I watched the children at the big table through the doorway, their books spread out, their laughter easy. Once, a boy looked my way and waved a small, honest kindness that made my throat ache. But those small gestures did not belong to me. I learned to tuck them away like secret bread. The younger brother invented new ways to be cruel that first week. A jab, a cold word, a lamp of disdain when I failed to fold the napkins exactly as his mother taught. He would stand behind me while I worked and watch the dust settle at the edges of rugs, measure my pace like a man timing a metronome, and then snap, faster. His voice carried a weight meant to bend people. When I tried to explain I had never been taught to tie a certain knot or that in our house we rinsed the cloth differently, he'd laugh in a way meant to make me feel foolish. Once, when the tea I served was a shade too weak, he took the cup from my hands and threw it into the sink, the china shivering in a way that felt like a warning. I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. Fear is a strange teacher. It instructs you in the smallest ways to survive. I learned the schedules of anger, the timing of the quiet before a foot crunched across a corridor, and how to make myself fit into a corner so no one would look at me twice. In that house, people had many kinds of power. The lady of the house could smile and send me out to mend the torn curtain with a bit of pity in her eyes. The children could ask for an extra slice of bread and it would appear. The gardener could stone the flower beds into perfect rows and nobody questioned him. But there was a power that did not need to be given, the power to humiliate, and the younger brother had it like an heirloom, kept to my small duties and to the small light inside me that still loved words. At night, when everyone else had gone to bed and the house thudded with sleep, I drew the curtain over the window of my tiny room and opened my notebook. I wrote about the smell of lemon polish and the way the eldest child hummed when he read. I practiced letters until they became friends again. Friends were the rarest things in that mansion. I found one in an unlikely place, the housekeeper, a woman who used her apron like a shield, who moved with a steady patience that had been carved into her bones by years of careful living. Once, when the younger brother had scolded me for leaving a linen folded incorrectly, she brushed her hand over my shoulder with no one looking, and said softly, "Keep your head. No one has the right to take your heart." Her words were small medicine. The first time he raised a hand, I remember the sound more than the contact. It was sharp, like a slap of wind. I stumbled backward, the world tilting as if someone had tipped the house a degree. He told me I had been slow, clumsy, beneath his notice, a boy's cruel laughter following. I pressed my palm to my cheek not because it hurt terribly, but because it was proof that my small body could be the object of a grown man's temper. I learned quickly how to hide things. A scarf tied high on the neck covered a swelling, a slight limp could be explained away as a twisted shoe. We had rules at home about dignity, never to show weakness. It was an old lesson, and it guided me like a stubborn star. But hiding requires energy. It eats at the inside of a person, and after a while you feel like a refugee living in a room with many locked doors. Each lie you breathe out to protect the family's honor is another brick in the wall you build around your true self. Not everything in the mansion was bleak. There were mornings the cook would slip me a warm piece of flatbread, or the younger child would drop a pencil in my hand with a grin. There was a window in the laundry room that faced the back lane. Through it I watched the world go by, an old woman selling cloth, a boy chasing a kite, a dog that bared its teeth at every stranger. Those glimpses of life stitched up the edges of me like small, steady stitches. At night, I would whisper to myself the list of things I wanted to be when I grew up. I promised myself learning, to finish the book, Hafried at home, to learn a trade, to be someone who could stand without trembling. One day, I told the dark quilt that covered my window, "This will not be the whole of me." By the end of my first month, I had learned the house's rhythms. I could predict the servants' steps in the corridor, the hour the children woke, the moment when the younger brother's smile turned into the small baritone snarl that came before a scolding. But there was one thing I refused to learn: how to be afraid of my own voice. I kept my notebook close and wrote names of things I intended to do, small tasks, ridiculous dreams, the arithmetic of escape. It was a promise I made in the silence between chores, nothing dramatic, just a line in my book: I will not live swallowed by someone else's power. I pressed my thumb over the ink as if sealing the vow. That night, as I lay on my thin mattress listening to the house breathe, I did not know that the story would bend toward a place I could not have imagined. A day when the world outside would open its mouth and speak for me. A day when the one who crushed me would find himself trapped in the smallest of cells. Not of stone but of consequence. But that is later. For now, this is how it began. A young girl with a notebook, a plain scarf, a promise in a pen, and a house that did not know how to be kind. Life in that mansion was ruled by invisible laws. They weren't written in any book, but you could feel them as clearly as the weight of a chain. Every breath, every step, every word had to be measured, trimmed, and adjusted to fit the invisible expectations. If I lingered a moment too long in the hallway, I was accused of idleness. If I hurried and dropped a plate, it was clumsiness. No move was safe. No gesture was free. The younger brother thrived on these invisible laws. He seemed to invent them as he went along, each day a new decree. One morning, he told me my footsteps on the marble were too loud. The next he said I was too quiet, that silence made me suspicious. If I lifted my eyes, he said I was insolent. If I kept them down, he said I was sly. It was a game for him, and a prison for me. I learned to live in constant calculation, like an animal listening for the sound of a predator's paw in the grass. My heart grew sharp, my senses sharper. I could smell his presence before he entered a room, the faint whiff of cologne mixed with cigarette smoke. I could measure his moods in the way he adjusted his cufflinks or tapped his shoe. My survival depended on it. It was a morning like many others, pale sunlight, the children's voices echoing faintly from the upstairs corridor, the scent of fried bread wafting from the kitchen. I carried a jug of milk to the dining table, my hands stiff from scrubbing pots. The jug was heavy, the porcelain cold against my skin, a small tremor in my fingers, and the milk spilled over the table's edge, white rivers running across polished wood. The sound of his chair scraping back was like thunder. He rose slowly, deliberately, eyes locked on me, my breath caught in my throat. His words came soft, cruelly soft. "You waste what you don't earn." Then came the slap, hard enough to knock the jug from my hands, porcelain shattering across the floor. I scrambled to clean, my knees scraping against the stone tiles, tears burning though I forced them back. He struck me again, not for the mistake, but for the tears. "Don't cry here," he said. "Your face dirties the room." That day left more than bruises. It left a question that circled in my mind each night. Was I truly less than human in his eyes? Or was cruelty simply the only language he spoke? What pained me most was not always his violence, but the silence of those who watched. The lady of the house, my employer, saw the red marks on my arm, the way I limped when I carried laundry. She sighed once, gently, and said, "He is young, you mustn't provoke him." As if his temper was my invention, as if bruises were born from my imagination. The other servants knew. Their eyes slid away when he scolded me. Their mouths stayed shut when he mocked me. Some pitied me quietly. Others feared losing their livelihood. No one spoke. Silence was a currency in that house, and no one could afford to spend it. And so I learned to carry my pain like a hidden bundle, to wash dishes with sore hands, to bend with aching ribs, to answer every call with a meek yes, sir, that tasted like ashes on my tongue. One night, unable to sleep, I sat by the small window in my room. The scarf my mother had given me was draped across my knees, worn and thin from my constant clutching. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and watched the lane outside. There was freedom even in the stray dog that padded through the dust, in the cart boy who whistled a tune as he pushed his wooden wheels. They belonged to themselves. I did not dot. It was then that I wrote in my notebook again. My hand trembled, but I carved the words firmly. I am not less. I am not a shadow. I am not theirs to break. I didn't know how long it would take for those words to matter, but they burned in me like a coal, and I held them close. Weeks turned into months. The bruises multiplied. Sometimes he used his hands, sometimes, worse, a cane, a belt. He called it discipline. But discipline is what you give a child you love when you want them to grow straight. His was punishment without purpose, cruelty without end. He punished me for existing where he did not want me. I began to wonder if this was all my life would ever be, a chain of days measured by chores and fear. I was only 14, but the child in me was already gone, buried under silence and pain. Yet, even then, sparks of life clung to me. The cook's warm bread, the housekeeper's soft glance, the laughter of the youngest child when he tried to balance spoons on his nose. These were reminders that humanity had not left the world entirely, that maybe, someday, I could claim mine back. That was the beginning of my endurance. I had not yet found my strength to fight, but I had found my strength to survive, and sometimes survival is the first rebellion. There are moments in a life when suffering moves from the shadows into the daylight. Until then, pain can be hidden beneath scarves and excuses, but when it spills into public view, it changes shape. It becomes undeniable. That moment came one hot afternoon. I had been ordered to scrub the courtyard tiles. The sun pressed down like molten iron, and the soap stung my raw hands. The younger brother arrived, his voice already sharp with irritation. He complained that I was too slow, that the water wasn't clear enough, and then, in front of neighbors watching from across the lane, he struck me a backhand so hard I fell to the ground, the bucket spilling beside me. My cheek burned red, my lips split open. I lay there, stunned, as his shadow loomed over me. The neighbors whispered, some gasped. For the first time, witnesses saw the cruelty laid bare. My shame was no longer private, it was public, painted on my face. I scrambled to my knees, wanting to vanish into the earth, but the whispers did not vanish. They grew louder in the days that followed. In our world, gossip is both poison and cure. At first, I feared the shame that people would think me weak, clumsy, deserving of my fate. But I soon learned that whispers carry a different kind of power. Stories of what he had done traveled beyond the courtyard walls. The housekeeper told me quietly, people are talking, they've seen, they cannot deny it now. One neighbor, an older woman who sold cloth in the lane, caught me by the arm one morning when I slipped out for errands. She looked me in the eyes, her voice low and firm. Child, this is not discipline. This is a crime. Don't let them break you. There are people who will listen. Her words lodged in me like a seed. Crime, a word I had never connected to my pain. I had thought of it as fate, as duty, as punishment for my family's poverty. But she called it by its true name. The wealthy household grew uneasy with the talk outside. The lady of the house warned me not to speak of what happened. You mustn't exaggerate. These are family matters, she said, her lips pressed tight. She feared the stain on their reputation more than she feared the truth of what was happening within her walls. The younger brother, sensing the eyes of neighbors, grew more careful in public, but crueler in private. His whispers cut deeper than his hands. No one will save you, even if they know you're nothing to them. But the whispers outside grew bolder. One day, as I returned from the well, I overheard two men talking. Did you see what he did to the servant girl? That boy will bring shame on his family. The word shame stung, but it was not mine anymore. It was his. Among those who noticed was a retired schoolteacher who lived near the lane. He had seen me carrying loads too heavy for my thin frame, had heard the shouts echoing from the courtyard. One evening, as I paused by the back gate, he approached gently. Do you still have your notebook? He asked. I blinked, startled. I did not know how he knew, but I nodded. He smiled sadly. Write everything, every bruise, every word. Write it down. Someday, it will matter. That night, I began. I recorded each act of cruelty, each insult, each wound. My notebook became both a witness and a shield. For the first time, I felt that my suffering was not vanishing into silence, it was being gathered into evidence, into truth. The real break inside me came not from a blow, but from a command. One evening, the younger brother ordered me to kneel and polish his shoes as he mocked me. My hands trembled, my knees bent, but then, something stopped me. The words of the cloth seller, the teacher, the housekeeper echoed in me. Crime, witness, truth. I looked up at him, my voice barely above a whisper. No. It was the smallest word I had ever spoken, but it was also the heaviest. His face darkened, his hand raised, but something in my eyes must have unsettled him. He struck me, yes, but with less force than usual. Then he stormed off, muttering threats. That night, as I sat with my notebook, I realized I had crossed a threshold. I had refused. I had planted a flag inside myself, and once planted, such a flag cannot be torn down. The whispers outside turned into questions, and questions into anger. Neighbors began to notice when I limped, when my arm hung stiff, when my face carried fresh marks. Some servants whispered of going to authorities. The housekeeper's eyes grew fierce. She began leaving bandages quietly by my bedside, and then one morning the retired teacher said the words that changed everything. You do not belong in that house. You belong before the law. I didn't know yet how the law could work for someone like me, but for the first time, the prison gates in my mind began to crack. Somewhere, beyond the mansion's walls, justice was waiting, and it had begun to turn its gaze toward us. The morning after I whispered that dangerous word, no, I felt different. My body still ached, my face still stung from his hand, but inside me something had shifted. I had tasted resistance, however small, and it burned in my chest like a hidden fire. For the first time, I began to imagine that survival alone might not be enough. Perhaps I could escape. Perhaps I could even fight back. The house seemed to sense the change in me. The younger brother watched me with narrowed eyes, suspicious, as though my silence was no longer obedience but rebellion. He tried to push me harder, his punishments sharper, but my mind was elsewhere now. I was no longer measuring only his footsteps. I was listening for opportunities. It was during this fragile time that the cloth seller woman from the lane found me again. She pressed a folded scrap of paper into my palm as I passed through the gate on an errand. There are people, she whispered urgently. People who will help you. Don't be afraid to speak. Her eyes were fierce, insistent. I unfolded the paper in secret that night. It had the address of a community center, a place I had never heard of. The words beneath said simply, "We defend children. We defend workers." The idea seemed too large, too impossible. Who would defend a girl like me against a wealthy family? Who would believe me against their power? Yet the scrap of paper burned in my pocket, daring me to dream of justice. I kept writing in my notebook, every detail more carefully than ever. Dates, times, the words he used, the marks on my skin. The teacher had told me it would matter. I didn't understand how, but I believed him. The act of writing itself gave me strength. Each line was a reminder that I was not invisible, that my suffering was real and could not be erased. Sometimes, when the younger brother raised his hand, I would think to myself, this will be written, this will not disappear. And though he did not know it, that thought gave me power he could not touch. It was not I who first brought the law to the mansion's gates. It was the neighbors, the gossip, the whispers. The quiet fury of the community had grown too loud to ignore. One afternoon, two men in uniform appeared in the lane, speaking with the cloth seller and the retired teacher. I watched from the window, my heart hammering. The younger brother paced inside, restless, sensing danger. That evening, the housekeeper came to me with hurried steps. "They are asking questions," she whispered. "About you, about him. Be ready, be ready." 2 words that filled me with both terror and hope. 4 nights afterward, I could not sleep. I rehearsed in my mind what I might say, how I might stand. Could I find the strength to speak the truth in front of strangers? Could I bear the storm it would bring? The lady of the house grew nervous. She called me into her room one evening, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You mustn't exaggerate," she said, her voice low but urgent. "He is young, hot-tempered, but he means no true harm. Think of our family's name. Think of your own future. If you speak against us, you will lose everything." Her words shook me. For a moment, fear threatened to smother my new spark. What if she was right? What if my voice only destroyed me? But then I remembered the teacher's advice, the cloth seller's fierce eyes, my own notebook full of evidence. I looked at the lady of the house and thought, "You fear shame more than truth, and that shame is not mine to carry." The day came suddenly. Officials arrived, their questions direct and firm. They asked about my duties, my hours, my treatment. My hands trembled as I answered, my voice cracking, but I spoke. I told them about the slaps, the kicks, the spilled milk, the bruises, the humiliation. I showed them the notebook, my secret record. Their eyes grew hard as they flipped through the pages. One of them said softly, "You are brave to write this, brave to speak." The younger brother's fury was a storm contained only by fear of the uniforms. He glared at me across the hall, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there, and it gave me courage. From that day on, the balance of power began to shift. He still tried to intimidate me, but the neighbors were watching. The authorities were circling. The silence was breaking. His arrogance cracked, replaced with desperation. I was still afraid, yes, but my fear was no longer a prison. It had become a weapon, and the more I spoke, the stronger I felt. For the first time since I had entered that mansion, I began to believe the gates that once trapped me might soon open, and when they did, it would not only be for me, but to send him where he belonged. It happened on a gray morning, when the air was heavy with the scent of rain. The officials returned, this time with papers and authority that could not be denied. They entered the mansion not as guests, but as investigators. Their footsteps echoed against the marble floors, their eyes sweeping over the family portraits as if measuring the weight of generations against the truth of one man's cruelty. The younger brother was summoned into the hall. His arrogance flared at first. He laughed, dismissing the officials, calling the accusations lies. "She is nothing," he sneered, pointing at me, "a servant girl with a grudge. You would take her word over mine." But then they laid the notebook on the table. My notebook, filled with months of careful notes, my trembling handwriting preserved like testimony. One official flipped through the pages, reading aloud the dates, the incidents, the words spoken. The silence in the room grew thick, every word echoing against the walls that had once protected him. The lady of the house protested, her voice shrill, pleading for mercy, for reputation. But the officials were unmoved. The law had entered the mansion, and with it, the walls began to crumble. They asked me to speak, there, in front of everyone. My throat tightened, my knees shook, but I forced the words out. I described the blows, the insults, the spilled milk, the slap in the courtyard. My voice cracked but did not break. With every sentence, I felt the chains around me loosen. For the first time, I was not whispering into a notebook. I was telling the world. The younger brother's face darkened, his smirk faltered, his fists clenched at his sides. He tried to interrupt, to shout me down, but the officials silenced him. The law had given me a stage, and for once, he was the one forced to listen. The decision came swiftly. The officials produced handcuffs, cold and metallic. When they clasped them around his wrists, the sound was louder than any slap he had ever given me. He struggled, cursed, his voice echoing down the grand hall. But no one came to defend him. The silence of others, which once protected his cruelty, had turned against him. Neighbors gathered outside, watching as he was led away. For the first time, their whispers were not about my shame, but his dot. I stood at the window, my heart pounding, as he was shoved into the waiting vehicle. In that moment, the mansion that had been my prison no longer seemed so impenetrable. Its walls had been breached by justice. The days that followed were a blur of hearings and testimonies. I sat in a courtroom, the judge's gaze heavy upon me, the audience filled with curious faces. I spoke again, telling my story, piece by piece. My words shook, but they stood firm. Witnesses came forward, the cloth seller, the retired teacher, even the housekeeper. Their voices joined mine, weaving a net of truth that could not be untangled. The younger brother sat across the room, his arrogance stripped away. He looked smaller now, diminished, a boy who had wielded cruelty like a sword only to be disarmed by the truth. His lawyer spoke of youth, of temper, of misunderstandings, but the evidence was undeniable. My notebook, my scars, the witnesses, they painted a picture too vivid to ignore. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Guilty. The words struck the air like a bell. He was sentenced, not to a slap on the wrist, but to real consequence, time behind bars, time to taste the prison he had once forced upon me. I closed my eyes as relief washed over me. For years, I had been his prisoner, living in fear within the mansion's walls. But now, he was the one behind bars, and I was free. The wealthy family's name, once untouchable, was dragged through the mud of public shame. The lady of the house avoided my eyes, her lips pressed thin with bitterness. But I no longer cared. Their silence had been their choice. My voice had been mine, and my voice had won. The neighbors greeted me differently now, no longer with pity or hushed whispers, but with nods of respect. The cloth seller clasped my hands and said, "You stood taller than the mansion itself." The retired teacher's eyes shone with pride. "Your words were your sword, child. Never forget that." As I walked away from the courthouse, the sky opened with rain. It soaked my clothes, plastered my hair to my face, but I lifted my arms and let it fall. Each drop felt like a baptism, washing away the dust of fear, the stains of humiliation. I was no longer the girl bent over buckets and brushes, no longer the shadow in the corner. I was someone who had fought, who had endured, who had seen her oppressor shackled by the very system that once ignored her. And in that moment, I realized the truth that would carry me through the rest of my life. Survival is strength, but speaking is power. My words had broken my chains. My courage had turned my prison into his. Freedom was not a door that opened in a single moment. It was a path I had to walk one step at a time. After the trial, I left the mansion behind with nothing but the clothes I wore and the notebook that had saved me. I carried no riches, no possessions, but I carried something greater: my voice, my story, my dignity. For a time, I lived with the retired teacher and his wife. They gave me a small room, meals at their table, and something I had almost forgotten how to feel: safety. Nights were no longer haunted by footsteps outside my door. Mornings no longer filled with fear of what mistake might bring punishment. Slowly, I learned to breathe again. The teacher encouraged me to return to school. "Your mind is sharper than you think," he told me. At first, I resisted. I was too old, I thought, too scarred, too far behind. But he placed books in my hands and said, "Each page is another key. Keep turning them, and you'll unlock doors you never dreamed existed." So I studied. I scribbled letters by candlelight. I traced numbers until they blurred before my eyes. The same hands that once scrubbed floors now turned pages. And with every lesson, I felt pieces of myself mending. I was no longer just surviving, I was growing. Years passed. I became a woman who not only carried her scars, but also wore them as proof of resilience. I began working at a community center, teaching girls like I once was young, poor, often silenced, sometimes working as servants in homes that did not see their humanity. I told them, "Your voice is your shield. Don't let anyone take it from you." When I looked into their eyes, wide and uncertain, I saw myself at 14. And when they smiled, shy but hopeful, I saw the future I had fought for. A future where they would not bend beneath the weight of someone else's cruelty. Years later, I visited the mansion again, not as a servant, not as a prisoner, but as a free woman. The family had moved away, their wealth scattered, their name tarnished. The gates stood rusted, the walls cracked. I touched the cold iron bars that had once caged me and whispered, "I am not yours anymore." Then I turned my back and walked away, carrying only the strength of my survival. Now, as I sit in this rocking chair, gray hair framing my face, my grandchildren gathered around me, I tell the story not to frighten them, but to remind them. Life will test you, I say, my voice steady. It may try to break you, silence you, make you believe you are small. But remember this: even in your darkest hour, you carry light. Even when you feel like a prisoner, you have the power to become free. They listen, wide-eyed, their small hands holding mine, and in their eyes, I see the promise of a world better than the one I endured. My employer's brother once thought he could own me with fear, but fear was not stronger than truth. Fear was not stronger than resilience. Fear was not stronger than a girl who chose to write, to speak, to stand. I was once his prisoner, but in the end, I became my own liberator. And that, my children, is the story of how a servant girl became a survivor, how a whisper became a roar, and how even the smallest voice can change the course of justice.